find your spots, we'll get started. Welcome. Good afternoon. Thanks for coming. I'm Stephen Bolton, the director of Dairy Guelph, and I've got the great pleasure to welcome Dr. Sarah Bolton as our guest seminar speaker for this afternoon. Sarah's here on a visit from Australia. She's a veterinarian there. She worked in practice. She's managed a large dairy. She worked for several years with Dairy Australia primarily with their animal welfare program, and since earlier this year has been working with Greenham, a large Australian beef processing company. In case that wasn't busy enough, she's also a PhD student at University of Melbourne, and with a strong dollop of Canadian content, with a connection at UBC with Marina von Kaiserling, who's her co-advisor for her PhD work. Much of her work at Dairy Australia, and I think with her PhD as well, has been involved around dairy calf or surplus dairy calf management and welfare, and that's what we've asked Sarah to share some of her research work and her industry experience from Australia with us on that subject this afternoon. So without further ado, thank you for being here. Welcome.
Thank you for the very extensive
welcome Sarah.
Thanks everyone, and thank you for the very extensive and very accurate bio, Stephen. That was very, very well done, very well studied, given that I gave you no prior information. But a huge thank you to everyone for having me here today. It is an incredible privilege for me to be here on the other side of the world. As Stephen mentioned, I've got some PhD work happening with the University of British Columbia, so studying through University of Melbourne, but Nina von Kaiserling is an external supervisor on my committee, and someone that I've collaborated with for a few years, and I've had the pleasure of being over here in Canada, most of the time in Vancouver, and this is now week 7 for me, so I've absolutely loved my time here and genuinely don't want to go home. So I'm really glad that you guys have allowed me to come here and chat about one of my favourite topics for a little while. So in this presentation, I thought it's worthwhile me giving just a little bit of an overview of the Australian dairy industry. I know there's some people in the room that are probably going to be pretty familiar with that. But sort of using that, I guess, as context for having a look at the surplus calf challenge, particularly through an Australian lens, how the challenge is similar but different in Australia to what it is here, and then looking at some of the work that I've done as part of my PhD, but also through my previous work with Dairy Australia, in order to start moving that challenge forward a little bit. And a lot of that is sort of looking at the problem through the lens of complex or wicked problems, and starting to think about some new ways that we can address some of these highly complex challenges, and also a very quick look at where are we sort of heading, what's the future direction, and what sort of challenges we're going to be up against, and what sort of frameworks do we need to tackle them. So very sincere acknowledgement to many of the organisations that have allowed this work to happen and for me to be here today, including the Dairy Up program of work, which funded a lot of the research, as well as Dairy Australia at the University of Melbourne, and of course to the Animal Welfare Program at UBC for hosting me. So in Australia, the majority of the dairy industry is located in the southeast of the country. So most cows are in the state of Victoria, which is down the bottom in the southeast, and in Tasmania, the little island that we often forget about down the bottom. Generally a coastally located industry, and the majority of the production systems are heavily grazing based. So we have just under 4,500 farms with just under 1.4 million dairy cows. So a general trend towards less farms, more cows per farm, with an average herd size of 300 cows, which is up from about 270 a few years ago. So we generally have a heavily Holstein-based herd with some Jerseys and crossbreds in there as well. More than 95% of our farms are grazing-based. We are starting to see a few more farms adopting housed systems, largely in areas that are struggling with reliable rainfall and water access in order to grow pasture, but largely still pasture-based, where those cows are getting about 65% on average across the different regions of their feed from grazing. And in some regions of the country, we have highly seasonal calving systems or production systems. And the idea there is that we are trying to match peak lactation within the herd with peak grass growth in order to have a low cost and ideally high profit system. And so this is a milk production graph from the state of Victoria in the 2022 financial year. And what you can see is that milk production spikes around our springtime. And I guess this is particularly relevant for the surplus calf challenge in that in order to maximise profitability in these systems, we are trying to have as many cows as possible in peak lactation at the point that that peak grass production is happening in spring. And so what that means in practice is that we can often have the majority of the herd calving in a 6 to 8 week period, which means all our calves come at once, and we're trying to deal with quite the glut. And when we're looking at all those calves, we're all pretty familiar with the concept of replacement calves and non-replacement or surplus or whatever your preferred terminology is, and the different management pathways that they can go through in different parts of the world. Certainly in Australia, we do raise some of those animals for beef, and that fluctuates in different years, and I'll go into that in a few slides' time. Some are raised for veal. The veal industry in Australia is very small, so not many go through that pathway, but a large number of calves do go through this sort of umbrella terminology that we use for early life killing. And whether that's the calf going to the abattoir at 5 days of age, which is the minimum age for transport to a meat processing facility in Australia, or whether they're euthanized at birth on farm, we tend to sort of refer to that whole bucket as early life killing because that's the particular practices or the two practices that are really looming as a genuine threat to the industry's social license to operate. And so these data are most recent from Dairy Australia's Animal Husbandry and Genetics Survey, which is conducted every 3 years. So these results are from 2022. One of the questions in that survey asks dairy producers of all the calves that are born to your herd each year, what percentage are expected to be managed through different pathways. And so last year we had 42% of calves expected to be used as replacement females, and that included some that were destined for live export, which is only a small percentage, so we bundled them in together. 23% were expected to go to the abattoir at 5 days of age to be slaughtered as a bobby calf. And that was at a time of record beef commodity prices, and we still had 23% of our calves being killed at 5 days of age for meat. 26% expected to be raised for dairy beef or mature veal, 5% to be euthanized, and 4% other. Quite often get asked the question, what's the other? This survey was conducted by an external research provider, and we don't actually have that information, so the joys of paying other people to do your data collection. And I was at Dairy Australia at that time, so I have to wear that one. These results are the same question, but split by what we call regional development program. And the reason these data are interesting is that the national data from the previous slide is on the left. The blue bars are replacement heifers, the orange are dairy beef or veal, green is bobby calf slaughter at 5 days, and yellow is at birth euthanasia on farm. And when we look to the right-hand side, we can see different regions or different dairying regions across the country. And there's quite a lot of variation in the number of calves that are either raised for beef or that are killed in the first few days of life. And what's really interesting is that regions such as Dairy New South Wales in the middle, in general, tend to have more Holstein cows, more year-round calving, easier access to feedlots, grain production, and much less easy access to abattoirs that kill calves at 5 days of age, and hence we see a lot more beef production in those regions. Regions such as Tasmania on the far right, West Vic third from the left, and Gipps Dairy fourth from the left, much more seasonal calving systems, much more of your New Zealand style dairy system, more Jersey genetics, more calves all coming together in sort of a 6 to 8 week period, and they're all geographically located close to abattoirs that kill calves at 5 days of age. And unsurprisingly, we see much less beef production in those regions and much more early life killing. And then if we zoom out over several years, year on year, the number of calves killed at 5 days of age varies quite significantly. So back in the 2014-15 financial year, because our financial year ends halfway through, we had a record high of just over 500,000 calves killed at 5 days of age. We don't have the data from the financial year just ended, but at the end of the second last financial year, we had a record low of just over 200,000 animals killed at 5 days. And this is one of my favourite slides, because if you happen to take the data that comes from the annual average beef commodity price, which we call our Eastern Young Cattle Indicator, or the EYCI, there's an almost perfect inverse relationship. And so what this information is telling us is that dairy producers are making the decision as to whether or not they send a calf for slaughter at 5 days of age based on what the beef commodity price is doing at that point in time. Interestingly, if that animal is raised for beef, which is much more likely to happen when the beef price is high, 2 years later, by the time that animal becomes a beef carcass, the beef commodity price is likely to be pretty different. And so this is really at the crux of the challenge when it comes to how we're managing these calves. We're very aware across the industry that early life killing is a significant threat to social license, but being able to consistently direct these calves away from early life killing and into beef production year on year in the face of what will likely be continued volatile commodity prices and seasonal conditions such as drought is going to be a huge part of the challenge. And I guess if I throw back to 2018, when I had recently left private practice, I was working as a government vet at the time and managing or co-managing a 300 cow dairy that was largely Jersey cows in New South Wales. This challenge of how we manage these calves was really at the forefront of my day-to-day operations. So I had a cow herd where we were only using 20% of the calves as replacement females. We had 80% of that 300 cow or 300 calf annual drop needing a home somewhere, not really being recognised as viable for beef production. And in my government vet work, going around and seeing a whole lot of welfare issues on farms, and in particular on smallholder farms that were opportunistically getting hold of usually male, usually Jersey calves at a few days of age, and then calling me in tears wondering why the animal was dying, because it was getting 2 litres of milk once a day, probably didn't get colostrum, all sorts of systemic issues. And so for me at the time, I went, I'm a vet, surely we can fix this. We just need to find the research report that tells us how to breed, feed and manage these animals and to make them profitable beef animals, and that'll solve all our problems. So we'll just do a literature search. It's kind of not much coming up. It's a little bit frustrating, surely the answer exists somewhere. And at about that time, I was really lucky that I randomly found myself in the car with the person who was talking to me about my career and what I wanted to do. And I was talking about wanting to spend time overseas, and she said, oh, have you heard of this thing called a Nuffield Scholarship? I said, nope, never heard of that at all. I went home and I did some Googling, and for those of you who don't know, it's an agricultural scholarship where you're provided a bursary to spend time overseas. You spend 4 months traveling the world, learning about global food production and investigating a particular topic of your choice. And so, unsurprisingly, I went, I'm going to go overseas and find the solution to this whole bobby calf dairy beef challenge, and I'll just find the right country. It's probably the US or Canada or something that's got the solution of how we're going to deal with these calves, and the problem will be solved. And so really on in that Nuffield journey, I hate using that word, but it really was a journey, I was starting to go, oh, maybe that sort of silver bullet solution doesn't exist anywhere, given that I've done a bit of traveling and it's not really coming up. And the time to think that that particular scholarship provides you is really valuable, because one of the things that I did was sat down and really tried to interrogate the question of, do we actually have to change how we're managing these calves? And looking at it through a purely economic lens, the answer really ends up being no. If you look at it year on year, we're responding according to what's most economically viable with these animals. And so if you're asking the question of, do we have to change, and you're purely looking at dollars and cents, the answer really at that time was no. But of course, does that mean that the overall question, or the overall answer to the question is no? And of course not, because back then, and even more so, or potentially to the same degree, now we have this rising social pressure, which is requiring us to really interrogate that question, do we have to change? And from a social perspective, the answer is yes, and we know that from a lot of work that's been done. And so for a veterinarian who was working at farm level, looking for the magic fact sheet somewhere that was going to solve the problem, suddenly delving into this social science and social license world was a hugely kind of daunting experience at first, but really quite fascinating. And so I guess some of the real sort of shifts in my mind came when I zoomed out and really looked at that bigger picture. And I guess in stepping you through some of the permutations and whatnot that my brain went through at the time, I think it's really kind of helpful for us to think back or think around the shifts that have happened in society in the past few decades. So pre-Green Revolution, pre-1950, we were still in a state in society, at least in the Western world, where the majority of the population was involved with food production. And of course, post-Green Revolution, out the other side, or post-1950, we now find ourselves in a situation where we have the minority of the population producing food for the majority. And so we're in that situation that we all recognise at the moment, where the vast majority of citizens describe their connection to agriculture as either distant or non-existent. But the thing is that food production is still deeply ingrained in our culture, and we all hold values about how food is produced, despite the majority of the population being disconnected from how it is produced. And hence setting up that disconnect around people having certain attitudes, certain values about how food is produced, but no longer being involved with or understanding the actual production practices. And so I guess that sort of gives rise to this concept of social license. And again, I think we throw that term around a lot these days without necessarily interrogating what it actually means. And this is adapted from a Bernie Rowland paper that he published back in 2011 that I love, where he describes this concept of social license as being an acknowledgement by society that they don't understand our industry and they don't understand why we do what we do, but that we are the experts and there is trust there that we know enough to do the right thing so that they don't have to worry about it. They can sit back and relax knowing that we, as the experts within the industry, know what we're doing and we've got it sorted. However, if it is found out that something is going on that doesn't align with community values, doesn't meet expectations, that is the idea of social license being lost, where the community will then intervene and bring in some form of intervention in order to maintain confidence that things are being done the way that they should be. And we often use Europe and animal welfare legislation as an example of that, where things are heavily regulated so that the standard is set by external forces rather than trusting the food production industry itself to do the right thing. And so really, I guess as a big picture, I often use this figure from von Keyserling 2013, von Keyserling et al. 2013, that really boils this concept of sustainability down into not just environmental sustainability, but critically the ability to also balance environmental, economic viability with social acceptability. And when it comes to the surplus calf challenge, balancing those two bottom circles really is at the heart of that challenge. So how do we maintain social license, social acceptability, whilst also remaining profitable and ideally having a neutral, if not positive, impact on the environment. And certainly when it comes to dairy beef, I think the environmental side of things is probably more of an opportunity for us when it comes to carbon and greenhouse gas accounting, but balancing those bottom two really is a key part of the challenge. And so it starts to bring about this idea of, okay, if we're trying to balance all these different things, starting to look at this as a truly complex problem. And if you're familiar with the idea of simple problems, complicated problems, and then the next piece is this complex or even wicked problem. And the term wicked problem, I often have to reassure people, doesn't mean evil or unsolvable. It's not a threat, but it was a term first put forward by a pair called Riddle and Weber back in the 1970s, who were urban planners of all things. But they described this next level of challenge called a wicked problem, which has many different features, but some of which that relate quite closely to the surplus calf challenge include the fact that these problems often have many different stakeholders who often have different versions of what the problem is, which can lead to a lack of ownership. And I can certainly speak to the Australian perspective, where over the last couple of decades there has been a lot of it's not our problem, it's yours, and it's not our problem, it's yours between the beef and dairy industries. But beyond just those two stakeholders, we have genetics companies, dairy farms, calf rearers, backgrounders, finishers, meat processors, milk processors, retailers, service providers, the communities, the animals themselves, if we're including them as stakeholders. So the stakeholder network is significant. These problems are often not stable, they're interconnected, multiple driving forces. The volatile beef commodity price and its influence on calf slaughter is one example of that, but we can add evolving understanding of what is best practice in terms of scientific research, or we can look at global policy or cultural changes, etc. They often involve behaviour change, and I think any of us that work in science or agriculture or at farm level, even just trying to convince someone to wash a bucket in a different way can be a challenge. And so that really is a key part of this. And they're socially complex, and it's that social complexity rather than technical complexity that tends to overwhelm our traditional approaches to problem solving. So I think we've had a lot of challenges in food production and in the dairy industry where it's been a matter of, we have a question, we have a problem, we've done the research, we've written the fact sheet, we've said, here, this is how you fix this particular problem. And it might be mastitis, it might be passive transfer, but even then, we still might actually have issues getting that change and getting that uptake. But then when we look at a problem that doesn't even have as simple an answer as that, that social complexity really does become a huge barrier. And so ultimately, when I was working at Dairy Australia a few years ago and had multiple people coming up to me going, so you're gonna fix this surplus calf feed? I'm going, oh my God, let's lower expectations. I did have to spend a lot of time thinking about, well, what are we actually trying to achieve here? And certainly, as I laboured on before, it really is about trying to balance social acceptability and economic viability, because we cannot raise all these calves for beef production if it is bleeding the business money, and equally we cannot continue to just kill them all in the first few days of life and expect us to have an industry in the next couple of decades. We are also trying to address multiple challenges simultaneously. So it's not just profitability, it's animal welfare, it's minimising impacts on the environment, or ideally having positive impacts. Labour availability is a huge one in Australia. If we're talking about rearing additional calves, there are dairy farms that are shutting down because they can't get enough people to feed their existing calves, let alone adding more. Regional differences I touched on in those results from the survey before, but things like carbon pattern feed production and access to markets. So it's certainly not a one-size-fits-all solution in a particular region, between regions, or even between years. Critically, if we want to actually have practice change, we obviously have to be promoting ownership and buy-in from the dairy farm first and foremost. But as someone who's now operating in the value chain, if we don't have market pathways for these animals that are profitable for every player in that value chain, we don't have a market pathway anymore. And so a few years ago, I was actually collaborating a fair bit with Dr. von Kaiserlink, who had started a little bit of work with a project in the maritime provinces here actually, and we were chatting away on Zoom at the beginning of the pandemic, and she said, have you heard of this idea of a deliberative democracy? I was like, that did not come up in my curriculum at vet school. No, no, I have not. And she went, oh, they've changed the transport regulations in Canada, and it's causing all these issues. And so Katie Proudfoot and a few of the others, Steve Roche was on there as well, probably some of the people in this room, they're looking at running this idea of a deliberative democracy. And I went, oh, okay, and I delved down into the research, and it's being used a bit in the salmon farming industry in BC, which you guys will be familiar with. It's being used in food security and legalisation of abortion in Ireland and all sorts of complex challenges. And the basic idea of deliberation or multi-stakeholder engagements is that you're working with a particular group of people who take on information, looking at how that might change their perspectives, leading to evolved thinking in order to progress along the road of addressing a complex topic and involving multiple stakeholders along the way. So what we did was we designed this project, and I will preface this by saying that at the time, I was not conducting research on this project. This was purely to actually get things happening on the ground, to actually try and get some practice change. And I had this really annoying professor from UBC going, you know, if you got human ethics approval on this, the transcripts would be really nice for a research project. And so that's what it became. But in the project design phase, we were really looking at, okay, how can we actually try and change some perspectives and affect some change here? So we pulled together a farmer focus group that also included pre-farm gate advisors. So we had vets, we had animal welfare researchers, we had nutritionists, farm business management consultants, etc. And then a range of different dairy farmers from different production systems, different backgrounds. What we did was we ran a focus group with them. We then ran some community focus groups to try and understand what does socially sustainable management of these animals look like. And then we brought our farmer and advisor focus group back together and fed them in the results of the community focus group and said, you know, you told us this in session 1, then we spoke to the community and this is what they told us, what do you think now? Then we went and conducted 1-hour interviews with value chain stakeholders, so genetics companies, backgrounders, beef finishers, beef processors, milk processors, and retailers were in there as well. Did our interviews, came back to our farmer group and said, hey, now we've spoken to the value chain, this is what they think, now what do you guys reckon? And because the purpose of this project ultimately was to use this farmer group to go through the process of interrogating the issue, change their perspectives, developed an informed understanding of the issue, and then it was the farmer advisor group's job to choose a research project that would be funded in order to address one of the most rate-limiting barriers to practice change. So that is outside of the research component, but this is sort of the on-the-ground piece. And spoiler is that the farmer group chose an economic impact analysis as the piece of work that they wanted done at that point in time so that they could better understand the economic implications of directing calves through different management strategies. But that's an aside. So our farmer group, I mentioned, had a range of different advisors in there and a range of different farmers. We now refer to this as a longitudinal qualitative study because it sounds really impressive and that's actually what it is, but we're also just trying to come up with a cool project. And they were using a deliberative methodology where they deliberate within their focus groups, they talk amongst themselves, they have the influence of time influencing their perspectives as they come back meeting after meeting, but they also have the interventions of each focus group coming in when we repeatedly brought them back together. So 24 people split into 4 groups of 8, 3 sessions and 4 sessions overall, and we have now subjected all those transcripts to inductive thematic analysis. The community focus groups were 3 groups of 8 again, 3-hour focus groups looking to understand not just their attitudes to surplus calf management, but sustainability and animal welfare broadly. So we started big and then brought them in. And then the value chain stakeholders, as I mentioned, we had 1-hour interviews with each of them, and I've already realised that I'm starting to run over time. We've got to what, 22?
Take all the time.
Okay, cool.
We're till
I won't
4
rush.
anyway.
So in terms of the major, or the key themes that came out from the analysis of our farmer focus groups, after the first group, the major themes, unsurprisingly, we split into social and economic. Under the social side of things, sub-themes included a farmer community disconnect. So a lot of conversation amongst our farmer group around the fact that the community just doesn't understand why they do what they do. We euthanize these calves or process them in the first few days of life for good reason. It's not because we're evil baby killing monsters. We do it because it's what we have to do and we try to make the best of it at the time. And if only we could just make the community understand that, then everything would be fine. But certainly a sentiment around nobody understands us. Conflicting priorities was a big one. So the interplay of conflict between welfare and ethics was a big one. So dairy farmers really sort of questioning, well, is it better to kill the calf at a few days of age, or should we raise it all the way through to beef? What if it doesn't have great welfare over the course of its life? And we certainly see that in current production systems. If it hits the ground and we euthanize it straight away and there's no suffering, what about that? When does the public actually think it's okay to kill these animals? Is there a magic line in the sand that the animal is suddenly old enough and we're all fine with it? A lot of recognition of that complexity, but also the interplay between welfare and economics and wanting to balance both of them. In terms of affecting change, a lot of discussion around whether it's something that needs to come from farm level. Should it be legislated? Should it be a market-based mandate? Who should be involved in making that happen? Technology is kind of an obvious one, things like sex semen, beef crossbreeding, even embryo transfer, looking at different technical options that are available in order to improve things. Calf rearing challenges was huge, labour, infrastructure, capacity, and confidence and return on investment in particular when it comes to actually increasing ability to, or increasing calf rearing capacity. And then the other one was around markets. So do we need new magic markets that are going to pay us a premium for these animals year on year? What existing markets are out there? How should we actually sell these calves and deal with them in the marketplace? And so, as I mentioned, we held the first farmer focus group, then we talked to a community focus group and fed those results back into the farmer advisor group at their second session. And very similar themes in that discussion, but a key shift was seen in that farmer community disconnect piece. So as one quote from our pre-intervention discussion group, so this is discussion group 1, before we had given them the results of the community focus group, which reads, so from a public perception perspective, we actually need to educate the public about why we do take calves off cows, because not every calf is able to suckle its mother, and not every calf's mother is able to have enough colostrum to actually ensure its vitality and virility later in life. So the conversation actually dovetailed into cow-calf separation, which it did at many points because they're interlinked issues. Post-intervention, so this is the conversation after we talked to them about what the community group actually told us. I've got a cousin who has a small business selling ethically produced milk. They keep calves on cows, and their biggest clientele is people who went away from milk because of ethical reasons. So it has brought people back to drinking milk. Is it just about, rather than fight the beast, is the answer, we must create the market demand? Let's stop fighting it. And so we're seeing some of the participants starting to go, maybe we don't just need to educate them into understanding, maybe there's something in this whole change what we do, align our practices thing. That was just one quote, it is definitely not representative, this is a focus group, but it was a really interesting shift that we started to see from some participants. Other participants actually pushed back hard, and when we told them what the community told us, they went, they're idiots, just educate them more, they have no idea. So you see that division. Post-value chain intervention, or I guess even if we go pre-value chain intervention. So we did our interviews, we spoke to our value chain stakeholders, then we held our farmer advisor focus group and gave them those results. Again, similar themes. Unsurprisingly, it was the dialogue around different markets that had a slight shift. So pre-intervention, a lot of discussion around, we just need to build a market. There was kind of this fantasy idea of this new market that hadn't been developed yet that was going to magically come in with a big wad of cash and give you heaps of money for whatever calf that you produced, and somehow we just needed to crack it. It's kind of like me at the beginning of my nutfield. And in this one, we want new markets for surplus calves to sell things like dog food and supplements. Okay, cool, yep, creative. And then post-intervention, this quote really doesn't speak to a change, and it's not designed to, because surprise, surprise, there wasn't huge shifts. But in this particular quote here, we see continued resistance against this idea of kind of moving in with the market. So it reads, we're a pedigree stud, I'm not in the market of calf rearing, I don't want to rear beef calves, I don't want to join half my pedigree breeding stock to beef. And so we're going, this is what the value chain's telling us, they've got markets, they've got specs, and if you change your breeding, your feeding, your management, you can align. And he's going, I don't want to change, I just want to do what I'm doing. So it's interesting. So breaking down that us versus them mentality really came when we shared that community perspective with our core farmer advisor group. Implementing alternatives to early life killing, certainly an opportunity to improve awareness and connectedness to existing markets was identified, but still that reluctance to shift, take on risk, and to change things at farm level. And in terms of opportunities ahead, certainly noted throughout that process a real appetite for collaboration amongst all the stakeholders, particularly the value chain stakeholders and the farmers. But the question was then, if everyone wants to collaborate and work together, and we need everyone to collaborate and work together, how do we actually make that happen? And this is also a side note to any sort of research, but in that farmer and advisor group, we also included some red meat production experts from the Dairy Australia equivalent in red meat, which is Meat and Livestock Australia. And they had the pleasure of spending 12 hours in deep discussions with all these farmers and all this talk around collaboration. And one of the great things was that 12 months ago now, Dairy Australia and Meat and Livestock Australia, as a result of that process, funded their first ever 50-50 levy funded project, which is going to be a new project called Growing Beef from Dairy that will develop extension and adoption material to help dairy farmers better understand what beef markets are available to surplus calves and how to optimise production within those markets. Decision support, trying to make decisions around what kind of calves you breed, how you feed them, what markets, at what age do you sell them, but also peer-to-peer learning. So Meat and Livestock Australia has an existing model called producer demonstration sites, where groups of farmers in local areas come together to share learnings from implementing practice change. But we have hybridised that and included some value chain stakeholders in the Growing Beef from Dairy model to try and help or force dairy farmers and value chain stakeholders to continue to share perspectives, grow and learn together. So that's now underway, which is very exciting. And I guess one of the things that I really love doing in sort of the broader animal welfare space is going, well, what's in front of us at the moment? What's 2 or 3 lily pads down the stream, and what's at that very distant horizon? And so as part of my PhD research, along with Nina and the UBC team, we have recently pulled together some preliminary results from a public attitude study looking at, okay, if we're going to raise these calves for beef, what sort of production systems or what sort of industry commitments or otherwise are actually going to influence public acceptance of how we change. So in this particular study, representative survey of the Australian public, we wanted to understand public attitudes to a system where the industry moved away from killing calves in the first few days of life, and they did that either through primarily use of intensive production systems, so feedlot finishing of the animals versus pastured finishing of the animals. And the other variable in the 2x2 that we used was presence or absence of an industry commitment to ending early life slaughter, because that was being discussed a lot at the time. So when participants came into the survey, they were given a vignette, pretty standard. To produce milk, dairy cows must give birth to a calf approximately once a year. The calves are usually separated within a day of being born and fed milk by the farmer. Most female calves will stay on the farm to produce milk. However, male calves can't produce milk, and not all the female calves needed for milk production. To manage this, male calves and surplus female calves are commonly used for meat production, and according to recently published figures, which was before the most recent ones that I showed earlier, about 40% of the calves born on Australian dairy farms are slaughtered for meat within 2 weeks of birth. So we had 1,000 participants, representative for region, age, gender, and urban versus rural. So they all got that vignette at the start of the survey, and then they were split into 4 treatment groups. The first group was told that the dairy industry has recently committed to discontinuing the practice of slaughtering calves within 2 weeks of birth, and instead the farmers are rearing them. We said 18 months of age because some are younger, some are older. These animals are kept in open paddocks and eat grass until they're slaughtered for meat. Same story with the pasture, but in this treatment they were told the practice of slaughtering calves within 2 weeks of birth has occurred for decades. The words are just to balance the cognitive load between the 2 treatments, but effectively the difference here is an absence of an industry commitment. This treatment, we're told that the animals were raised in a feedlot, so they're kept in pens with no access to grass and eat grain and hay before being slaughtered for meat, plus the industry commitment, and then feedlot, no commitment as the final treatment. Our hypothesis was that pasture-raised animals with an industry commitment would be most favoured by the respondents, and no commitment feedlot would be least favoured. And that's not actually what we saw. So pasture access had a significant effect. So attitudes to our animal construct were much more positive when the animals were raised at pasture, negative when they were kept in a feedlot. But the presence or absence of an industry commitment to ending early life slaughter actually didn't have an effect. And I think there's something going on here with this whole concept of social license, which is we actually just expect you guys to not be doing this anyway. And I don't feel particularly reassured that you've got some commitment to not doing it. The fact that you're doing it makes me feel not so great. And we can see that in that the animal attitude construct, even the pasture treatment, which was the most favourable, is still kind of at neutral. Like, you just told me all these calves are being killed, and like, that's great that they're on pasture, but still a bit meh. So anyway, take-home messages. I think it's really important for us to always zoom out and remember that science has addressed a lot of our challenges, but many of those that we are still left grappling with are highly complex. Food production is a community service, and it is deeply interlinked with values and culture. And evolving community values definitely need to be factored in to our food production practices. So always keep an eye on where are we at, where are we going to be in the future, how are we going to get there, how are we going to maintain that alignment and balance economic and social viability. And doing that through working with the needs of all stakeholders, including all industry stakeholders, but critically the public and the animals as key stakeholders in those conversations as well. And when I give versions of this talk to farmers, there's always someone that stands up and goes, yeah, but like, when are we going to get there? When is it going to be good enough? When can I finally go to bed knowing that we've just got it sorted, they're going to leave us alone, and we don't have to have these annoying, difficult conversations anymore? And I started preempting them and just putting this up at the end and going, whilst that is exhausting that we're never actually going to get there, we've come a really long way in a really short space of time. Homo sapiens has been a species on this earth for 300,000 years, I think, and it's only been in the last 300 or 400 that we've decided that animals can even feel pain, and that maybe we shouldn't sell human slaves. So I think we've come a really long way in a really short time frame. We're going to keep moving big distances, but that's one of the really exciting things about working in food production, working in animal science, and welfare and social science in particular. That's it.
Brilliant, thank you, Sarah.
Pleasure.
Really well done. Yeah, that was a wickedly good take. A lot of information and really good food for thought on a wicked problem that we face in the Canadian dairy industry as well. So with that, open up for questions for Sarah. Michael.
Yeah, really cool. Nice to see some data that we haven't seen that's in practice. Really cool. I wonder, like, with the farmer focus groups, you had just kind of said at the end here too, people, often producers, talk about when are we going to be there? And I wonder, with some of the entrenched positions that some of the farmers had, like, was there any sort of like resentment towards the public, like where things like, listen, we've come so far in just this last generation. I'm a progressive producer, and I think about what my dad did on the farm. Was there like this, like a latent resentment that was like a barrier to change?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very difficult to categorise farmers into a singular entity, and they exist on a spectrum, of course. And we deliberately tried to select via some very handy regional extension officers that we had in that particular region. We said, can you help us actually get a range of farmers with different attitudes to change, different attitudes to production practices? And yes, there were some people in the room that just really struggled with the whole concept. And one of my favourite stories is a youngish guy who was in the group, and he was just really battling with this whole concept of listening to the public. And it came out later on that he'd recently had a lot of challenges with mortality in his calf rearing operation, and it was a real stress that was sort of lingering in the background, and this idea that someone would tell him to raise even more calves, he was kind of going, ugh, and he started getting really quite sort of aggressive towards other people and quite upset, and at one point he just walked out of the room, and we went, ooh, okay, I know it's a bit awkward, but we'll just kind of keep going. And so in Australia we have bowling clubs, I guess similar to a football club here, but it's 11 a.m. and we're in a bowling club and we're the only people apart from the staff, but there happens to be a bar, and the bar is open. I didn't know the bar was open. And so, we're facilitating this, we're trying to bring people back down after participant X has just stormed out in a great big huff after upsetting everyone. And about 5 minutes later, he comes back with a pint and just sits down. And then was very well behaved and participated. He just needed a beer. So I think, whereas there are other people in the room that were going, no, we just need to shoot for the stars and do all the amazing things and love and puppies and kittens. And so, definitely a lot of that entrenched kind of pushback, but I think being able to recognise that spectrum of people, is the hard thing too. And how you actually, in looking to develop things that are going to help us affect change, being able to bear in mind that we're targeting a really varied audience is a huge thing, and setting up information to be able to be digestible to different segments of that particular group too.
Okay. Yeah, I guess I was thinking about it as like this, that, sometimes the lack of acknowledgement that it really has changed a lot.
Yeah.
And it's come a long way.
Yes.
And
but I think that's really helpful as well, to be able to sort of speak to that. And when you remind people, so your parents farmed? Yeah, my parents farmed. And how many cows did they milk? It's maybe like a third of the number that we do now. And what did the dairy look like? And in Australia 40 years ago it was a walk-through dairy, and you'd be very familiar with them in Queensland. They're still sitting out in paddocks, and things don't look now like they did 40 years ago. And a lot of those are changes that we can definitely be proud of, and we have come a long way in a short period of time. And so I think it's helpful to acknowledge those two things at the same time. Like, let's acknowledge the good work that we've done, whilst also having conversations about where we need to go.
Others?
Thank you for coming all the way up to Canada.
I was already in Vancouver, so it's not that bad.
Just, can you walk me again to the methodology or the last project? So you have these people, you have 1,000 people.
Yep.
And they were rural, not rural kids. And then you show them this is what's going on the problem.
Yep.
And then you said select these 4 different realities.
Sorry, I skipped over that methodology a little bit because I was getting a little bit concerned about time. They enter the survey, they get the vignette. So it's a common vignette at the start that says, this is the situation, cow has a calf not necessarily needed for replacements, and so the vignette that I read out. Then the 4 different squares were applied to a quarter of the respondents each. So 1 in 4 people had a different treatment, either being told that the animals were at pasture or not, or being told that there was an industry commitment to ending early life slaughter or not. And so after they read their common vignette and then their treatment vignette, we used an animal attitude construct. So it's a validated construct with 5 or 6 questions off the top of my head, like its scale of strongly agree to strongly disagree, of I think, I'm not going to be able to quote the questions off the top of my head because it's too much rolling around, but questions around the life lived by the animal in one construct, and then an open text response for qualitative analysis, tell us why you gave those responses. The second construct was attitude to farmers, so it was things like farmers are trustworthy, strongly agree, strongly disagree, farmers provide accurate information, strongly agree, strongly disagree, everything in between. And then the third construct was an industry attitude construct. So we saw significant effective treatment in the animal attitude construct, but the results in the farmer and industry constructs were less interesting. And from what we can see in the qualitative stuff so far, with that analysis still underway, it's kind of looking like there's a bit of confusion around what's the difference between industry and farmer, and in general, we tend to see a pretty high level of trust from the Australian public in farmers. So whilst they go, oh, I don't think the animal's having a great time, in the qualitative stuff that we've looked at so far, there's still a lot of, yeah, but farmers have it really hard, and this must be the only way they can do it. And so there's a lot of layers in that.
No, I understand that. Thank you very much.
you look at all at whether there was a divide between older farmers and younger farmers?
Yeah.
Or gender?
So our farmer focus group, again, was not representative because we had 12 farmers in the room, but we did intentionally include younger and older and male and female, and there were some husband and wife teams that came along because they assumed that the invite for one meant the invite for the other, which is perfectly fine. And I mean, it's a focus group, so you certainly can't speak to any kind of significant effect, but in general, you do see responses from females that tend to really want to be able to do the best things by the animals, and I mean, it's a gross generalization, and I feel bad even sort of speaking to it, but you often see in those husband and wife teams where he's going, oh, I just want to pay for this, and oh, but can't we do this, and but it's something that you see occasionally rather than something that I would call out as any kind of key effect, but a very good reason to make sure that we include that range of farmers in those focus groups.
And what about the age difference?
Yeah, so I think our youngest participant would have been early 20s. The oldest person in the room, I feel a bit rude again, he would have probably been late 60s. So yeah, we had a spread in there.
So this question, it's not directly related to your research, so it might not be fair, but
No, that's fine.
for your slide that you had up with kind of the learning and you had the peer-to-peer, I wondered like what the uptake of that is for like having producers be willing to run those educational, because like that got me so excited.
Yeah.
That you have that, and
yeah.
that I just wondered, they're busy,
Yep,
and
absolutely.
how does that go?
Yeah, so if you are interested in looking at more information, I can either send it to you, or you can Google Meat and Livestock Australia producer demonstration sites. So MLA, as we fondly refer to it as, has run this model for a very long period of time. They're all over the country. You can apply to set one up in your region, and there's usually a facilitator, sometimes a subject matter expert consultant, and a group of farmers. And being MLA, it's usually beef farmers, and they might have started using some sort of different feed source for the animals. And so they might implement that on a couple of farms, and then a group of local farmers all come together over a couple of years, they collect data, and they go, okay, Shelley, what's happening and how are you finding this, and what are the practical challenges, and how can we learn from each other? And it's this great model. Dairy Australia has a similar one called a focus farm, where one particular farm in a local region literally opens up the books. There is a farm business management consultant and a professional facilitator, and anyone in the local region can come along every few months, and on one day they might do the calf rearing operation, they might do silage making, they might look at the business performance, etc., etc. And so I guess both the Australian beef and dairy industries kind of have a fair bit of familiarity in their local regions with this peer-to-peer learning model. In terms of the uptake, we have the same challenges with capacity on farm. So this producer demonstration site is piloting in one region at the moment. I now have the privilege of being on the group as a value chain stakeholder because I work for a beef company now, so it's kind of cool to go from one end to the other. But I got the email from the facilitator that's going, okay, our next meeting is going to be online because we know you're all calving, and so hopefully you can join in while you're buzzing around on the quad bike. So yeah, it's definitely a challenge, but I think we have the good fortune of these models having been around for a long time and a lot of people having familiarity, and farmers will hear the word PDS or focus farm and go, oh, that's going to be good quality information, I'll go if I can.
Awesome. Good, thanks.
I have two questions, Stephen, so cut me off if you wish. My first one is, with the survey data, I would say here we're pretty confident we have leakage in our data, so we know calves are being born that never show up anywhere.
Oh yeah. Yep.
What does that do to survey data? It's like, in my opinion, it's like asking somebody what's your colostrum program, and every time it's always perfect, and it's never the case. So do they know the answer, and there's certainly life is a problem, and we're not getting the real goods, or what does that look like?
So the survey, first of all, I'll preface this by saying we are not like the UK or Europe where every calf has a passport and you can very easily do the maths to know if something was euthanized at birth or not. The best that we have is self-reported data. The survey that I showed at the start is a triennial survey from Dairy Australia. They surveyed 10% of Australian dairy farms that's balanced for herd size, region, a few other factors. So, you know, it's trying to get at reasonably reliable data. But the reality is that it's a phone survey that a research company is paid to do. And if I was in a room full of Australian dairy farmers and I say, have you had an annoying phone call from Dairy Australia recently asking you survey questions? They go, oh, yes. And so the reality is that those data are being collected via a phone call when someone is cruising along in the tractor or trying to get other stuff done. And someone's going, okay, now question 13, of all the calves that are born on your farm, what pathway are they being managed through? And they're going to go, oh, I don't know, like about this much through. So it is not perfect data at all. That said, the slide I had, which was the number of calves killed at 5 days, is based on total leviable quantity of animals killed at abattoirs. So when a bobby calf is killed at 5 days, it's charged at a different levy rate to what adult cattle are killed. So that is actually very reliable data that we get from the federal government. And it matches up reasonably well with the survey data for that portion of animals. So we have to take that information with a grain of salt, the survey data, and there's a lot of leakage, as you say, but when we have some information that we know is reliable, the gap is not too bad, so, yeah.
My second question, your von Kaiserlingedal Venn diagram with the sustainability. I've read recently where somebody's proposed, so you can react to this or pass, I mean, that we should add a fourth circle for animal welfare. Because it's not implicit enough to say that's social license.
So I've had versions of that slide where I put kind of like a bracket at the bottom and put animal welfare kind of encompassing all of it because it's both affected by and influences all three of them. And I agree with you. I've repeatedly looked at that diagram going, how do we sort of fit that in? Because it's all three, and then I've had people put circles around the outside and go, it's, you know, so it's got a circle around the outside or has it got a fourth circle in it, but they're all interrelated. Yeah, I completely agree. But I think at the very least, I usually try to point out, which I did not in this presentation, that welfare is both a key influencer and influenced by all three of those circles.
Sure.
You mentioned several times, you know, the need for economic sustainability, which is obvious. On this side here, I was interested with the cooperation between Dairy Australia and meat and livestock. You have to have a market for these calves. Is this not a disruptor for the traditional beef industry?
Well, as someone who works for a beef company, I think I'll speak to that. I'll speak solely to the Australian perspective, if that's okay. So we have 1.4 million dairy cows, about 25 million beef cows. And we export 70 to 80% of the beef product that we produce. So we already have quite a lot of beef, and it's historically been a case of we're exporting all this beef. If we're out the other side of one of our big droughts, there'll often be a shortage of beef animals because we cull a lot of animals because we can't feed them during droughts. And so we look to the dairy herd for more animals. And then when we rebuild the beef herd, we go, oh, we don't really care about these crappy dairy animals because we've got enough good quality beefies, so do whatever you want with those bobby calves. Speaking from the perspective of the company that I'm currently working for, they hired me as a welfare manager, but also to build up a dairy beef supply chain. They export 90% of the product that they produce, 70% of which goes to the US as certified humane, grass-fed, high-eating quality, Whole Foods restaurant stuff. What Greenham is really trying to do at the moment is get as many dairy calves as possible into those existing premium brands. There are a few reasons for that. The first is that they're geographically located in the heart of dairy country, and I think 90% of Australia's dairy animals are within trucking distance to our processing plants. The second is carbon accounting. So the International Dairy Federation greenhouse gas methodology that was published earlier this year or late last year is now saying that in greenhouse gas accounting frameworks, we should be attributing 85% of a cow's annual emissions to her milk production and 15% to her potential dairy beef calf. So at the starting line, we have a beef calf from a beef cow-calf operation starting with all of his mum's emissions, for that year because the breeder unit's emissions are allocated to her annual products. And we have the dairy beef calf potentially at the starting line with just 15%. And so they've got quite the head start. What happens to them in terms of lifetime methane production in particular is highly dependent on management, genetics, etc. But we have that advantage there at the start. And so whilst we don't have any low or zero carbon brands at the moment, we're very much looking at this as a space that we kind of need to get in front of. And then the third big piece is sustainability of sourcing. So whilst our national beef herd goes like this in alignment with whether or not we're in drought, the national dairy herd stays pretty constant. And so if we can set up long-term relationships with dairy farms, we can stop playing this, oh my God, there's cattle everywhere, and oh my God, where are the cattle? We can't find them kind of game. And then on top of that, at a global level, McDonald's is currently being pretty influential in this space as well. So McDonald's buys most of the trim from most of the Australian beef processors. And at a global level, from a sustainability perspective, they have been softly open about the fact that sourcing beef from the dairy herd is going to be a key sustainability focus for them going forward, for all of those reasons that I just covered, in addition to the welfare social license component, because McDonald's also obviously sells dairy products. So in terms of an Australian perspective, if the question is, are these animals going to flood the beef herd and disrupt everyone? Absolutely not. I've now got beef backgrounders calling me going, hey, I want some of those dairy beef animals because we want to get ahead in terms of carbon accounting and have reliable flow of animals coming onto the operation, and they're efficient. So we have beef backgrounders that we pay on live weight gains, so it's $2.50 per kilo live weight gain, and if they can have these animals coming in, turn them over, yeah, it's an option, and less capital investment in a beef breeder herd, which when you have a lot of droughts, you risk it.
No, thanks. So that would, the carbon footprint piece would really push towards the grass fed wouldn't it?
Well, it depends how you're looking at your accounting, I guess. And so if you're looking at a system that is super intensive, high growth rate, high concentrate input, if you can get big outputs for low inputs, then your accounting can look very different. But I have Australian farmers, especially the dairy farmers that are getting exposed to this certified grass-fed beef market for the first time, going, why the hell does someone want to buy grass-fed beef? Like, isn't grain-fed better? I thought it was better. And I'm going, well, some people, it's the nutritional side of things with omega-3s and whatnot, but some people have, strong values around the fact that it's more sustainable to have pasture-raised animals, and some people have strong ideas that it's more sustainable to have intensively raised animals. So it's a very interesting. I don't get involved in terms of opinions though.
Last call. Oh, brilliant. Sign of interest. Thank you very much. That was really, really worthwhile.
Pleasure. Absolutely.
Very informative. Thanks, Sarah. Thank you all for coming. We're adjourned.